Good morning to everyone. It's for me a great pleasure to be here. Uh, I am Edna Jaime, Vice President of the Executive Committee of the Paris Peace Forum, and also founder and director of Mexico Evalúa, a Mexico City policy-based think tank. We have a fantastic panel with people who are truly inspirational leaders. Allow me to introduce them. I want to start with Noel Alonso Murray. She is the Executive Director of Directorio Legislativo and creator of the Civic Space Guardian Project, a web tool to enhance public awareness of proposed laws or policies affecting the civic space in Latin America. Bienvenida, colega. I also want to introduce you to Salomon Ayala Derso. He's chairperson and commissioner of the African Commission of Human and People Rights and founding director of Amani Africa. Welcome, welcome, Salomon. Martin Tisnet, he's president of Luminate Strategic Initiatives. And we are waiting for Hannah Edward. She's about to arrive. She's president of the Iraqi Women Network. She's just arriving. Welcome, Anna. Very nice to meet you. Very, very nice to meet you. Now, regarding our main topic today, what is the civic space and why it is so important? To me, the civic space is the modern equivalent of the Greek agora, the public space that served as a meeting point for citizens of the ancient polis. The modern civic space is a place where we can all meet and discuss ideas, debate problems and solutions, contrast and compare policy alternatives, and arrive to some conclusions on how to improve our societies. In democracy, the civic space needs to be open to anyone, free for everyone, and safe for all. But democracy now is under attack around the world, and civic space are suffering for it. Let me share with you some shocking facts from the Sweden's VDEM Institute latest report on democracy. In 2011, 5 nations suffered deterioration in their freedom of expression at the hands of governments. By 2021, 35 countries were suffering from this deterioration. 10 years ago, only 5 countries reported alarming levels of toxic polarization of public discourse. Now 32 countries are suffering from this democratic disease. Forty percent of the world's population lives in electoral autocracies, while only 13% of local population lives in fully liberal democracies. So in this challenging context, let's start with a question for our panelists. I will start with you, Noel. And I would like to ask you, for you, what is a civic space? Why did you initiate this initiative of Civic Space Guardian, and how has been your experience? Do you work for Latin American countries? Do you work for countries worldwide? Can you just give us your perspective, please?
Yes, thank you, Edna. Yes, unfortunately, civic space and the shrinking of civic space is every day a more important topic. You shared with everyone some very sad news about the percentages of the world that is living in not democratic context. So yes, we've developed in Directorio Legislativo, the organization I'm part of, we've developed this tool, this digital tool, to give early alert to civil society leader and social leaders. So far, we work, this tool, we've applied it to Latin American countries, but it's a tool that can be used in any other context. We've started working at the end of 2019, and what's key in that is that we, with this tool, we give early alerts to the civil society organizations and any leaders that when there's these threats coming from either the executive branches or the legislatives on laws, decisions, decrees, and whatever decisions that are taken by public stakeholders, right? By public actors. So, and what's key is like the early alert. With this tool, we intend to give them time to react to these threats. Because unfortunately, what in many occasions happens, and to myself as well, being part of civil society, is that we tend to get to know the threats when they're too late, when there's little to be done, when a law is already being passed and it's in the plenary and not when it's at the committee level, when it's already published in the official gazette and not when it's being thought and debated within the cabinet. So what generally happens for civil society leaders is that we tend to get to know that information late, when it's too late. So this early alert is crucial for us, for all social leaders, really. So this tool, we try to do that. And by us, all, and by them, and all civil society actors, time to mobilize, to generate a public campaign, to be active in a legislative debate during, from the beginning, not in the end, from the beginning, when the legislator is, or the MP is thinking about introducing a bill about a certain thing. Unfortunately, this idea of getting at an early stage is every time more challenging, because in many countries, and in Latin America specifically, where we've started working, many of these political leaders have lots of power within their own Congress and in the decisions they take in the executives. So that time is becoming every year, like a smaller window we get as civil society leaders to act upon and to react and to, think about different campaigns, etc.
Let me ask you a question. Have you been successful?
If we look at the figures, we've not been successful because we live in a context where, these challenges, and unfortunately, they are becoming every year more important. So in that sense, we cannot say that we've been successful. We try to react, and all social leaders and all social organizations have found it every year more difficult to work. Well, there's all this, for example, these regulations coming. There's in many countries regulations that add more bureaucracy to the work that civil society organizations have to do, like the paperwork they have to comply with to be a legally recognized organization in the country, in El Salvador, in Venezuela, in whatever country we're working. So,
are there other actors that threatens civil space?
There are other actors, but mainly, at least in the way we've been working, it's the main threats are coming from the public sector.
Okay.
In terms of the civic space, in terms of the rights, because this tool, we analyze six rights, right? To information, to expression, assembly, etc. And all of these rights, these 6 rights, the main threat comes from political actors.
Congratulations for your work.
There's a lot to be done, really.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Hannah, it's great to have you here. And what I would like to ask you is the experience of building a democratic system in Iraq over the past 2 decades has been fragile, isn't it? What is the role of civil society, organizations in influencing the political process, public policies of the government to integrate very fundamental concepts as good governance, development, and respect of human rights.
Thank you very much. Here. Uh, this is,
Is-
2 decades, not a, 2 decades that we are living in Iraq. Our dream, the Iraqi, was to transform the country into a democratic system. And the role of the civil society as a young civil society after over 35 years of dictatorship. So we try first to spread or to promote the culture of human rights, the culture for, tolerance, the culture for accepting the others, the concept for dialogue. And it is essential for people who has been, under dictatorship and without any human rights, rights being guaranteed. So to change this, so we built our national NGO movement, speaking about that, the citizenship, how we say, the diversity of citizenship, the diversity of people in Iraq. There are many ethnicity, many religions, many sectarian. This is not easy questions, and especially after a number of wars, especially the coalition, the U.S. also war in 2003. So to build this new system of democracy depends on democratic. It needs people to understand civil education and to make, their participation in this, development. So we emphasize on advocacy campaign, on new legislation, especially legislation on, freedom of expression, legislation for peaceful assembly freedom, and others, for gender equality. It is essential in a country where religions and tribals make, a very dominant in the culture of the country. So that was our main approach, how to mobilize also the young people, because Iraq, it is 35% of 65% of its population under 30 years. So it is a huge power that can really make a change on the country. But unfortunately, that the system of what you call it, the ethnic and political quota, which has been maintained in the top of the government, has really made a very huge problems or challenges for change into democracy. So that's what we feel now. Democratic system in Iraq is absent, though that we have, what you call general elections, but general elections when the traditional parties like religious parties or Islamist religious parties and other also with totalitarian orientation parties, they don't want to change for a democratic system where people, they can really make the participation and the good governance in this. So exclusion of women, exclusions of young people from the decision makers, this is our essential how to open the way for them to be in this. So we started on quota for women, that it has been really integrated into the constitution of Iraq, where now we have in parliament now it is 95 women in parliament from total of 329 seats. So this is one of the to break the way for women to be in the decision making, participating in the decision making positions. Though that it is not easy, because the tribal customs in the country is very dominant. The absence of rule of law. Till now we are, facing this rule of law. There is the militia outside the government, and it means that the security and safety for the people is not guaranteed. So this is one of the challenges that we are working on, how to make the rule of law in the country. It is essential. So we try to make the advocacy campaign on mobilizing people, on trying to counter the violations of human rights, and so on. The peak of the civil society work was done during the protest demonstrations in the country, started in 2011 until in 2009. The peak it was on 2019 and 2020, where the uprising of the huge numbers of young women, young people being involved in the protest movement. That was really the peak moment in the country, that the expression of young people for a civil change, for a democratic change, for, recognizing the role of the young people, and especially young women too. We have, in this protest movement, we have lost more than 700 people being, brutally, attacked and dead during this protest movement, which has endured for more than 1 year. And till now, that's what we are really doing for that. Among them, a number of women too, being shot by the police and by the security and by the militia. Because the essential things in Iraq now, that the militia is controlling the power in the parliament and in the government, where for us it is something which we feel that the change for a democratic system is, unless to collect this weapon and to dissolve the militia and to adhere to the constitution and to the legislation which guarantee for people to participate actively, not for the others who they separate corruption. After, that's what we feel also one of the big challenge is the corruption. The corruption in the country now.
I ask you just to close your intervention, and then we come back. But you can conclude.
Oh, so this is also one of the things that the challenges in the country is very, very complicated, where corruptions mix with the power, with the weapons and with the militia, and also connected with the, what you call it, the manipulating the power for their own interest.
Thank you, Hannah. I admire you for your courage, and I hope you can be successful gaining space for citizenship, for democracy. So thanks a lot.
And for gender equality.
Of
this
course.
Is one of the very
I know that's one of your main priorities and costs. Thank you very much. Now I would like to ask Salomon. Salomon, I am really worried about freedom of expression, press freedom, and what I would like to ask you is, how are you failing to protect? Are we failing to protect journalists in the face of shrinking civil space? Laws criminalizing journalist works are proliferating, and there is no enforcement of laws meant to protect journalists. This is a specific worry for me, because in Mexico, journalists are being killed. So I want to know your opinion, what are you doing?
Thank you very much. The civic space is indeed, as you rightly said, under immense pressure, and this is a global phenomenon. Obviously, its manifestations vary from region to region, on account of the specific political, historical, and power dynamics in the different regions of the world. So we also experience the shrinking of the civic space on the African continent, although I have to say that the shrinking of the civic space is not the same across different regions and different countries, obviously. There are some regions and some countries that are most affected by the shrinking of the civic space, although it is an issue across the continent. There are some countries that do well, better than others. In terms of the specific category of people who are affected by the narrowing down of the civic space, yes, indeed, journalists and the media, broadly speaking, are the category of civic actors who get affected by this. Whether it is in terms of, for example, the judicial harassment that they are subjected to, which is basically the politicization and instrumentalization of laws and judicial institutions by those in position of power in order to harass, in order to actually intimidate the media and journalists. You find this particularly in countries that are considered to be having more authoritarian systems of governance. This is not unique to Africa, but you find in those kinds of situations those manifestations. Indeed, it's not limited to judicial harassment, imprisonment. It's also involves sometimes even physical violence that journalists and people in media are subjected to. You'd find this in many countries. If you see, for example, the report from press freedom monitors, that is one of the things that they monitor, which is the number of journalists who are imprisoned for exercising their vocation, the number of journalists who are assassinated or killed. Sometimes these killings and assassinations may not necessarily come from within the government. It may come from other non-state actors who actually use violence for purpose of pursuing, as she described, their own objectives and their own ideas. So we have a very, really challenging environment. I think we have to understand why this is happening. The context in which this is happening has to do with the global depreciation or basically regression in democratization, which gets reflected in various forms with the rise of populism, with also the polarization of societies. And it is in this context that we come to see major narrowing down of the civic space. It's worth noting that with there are various aspects. For example, it's not always the case that journalists or the civic space gets pressure all the time. There are certain moments in the life of a country when journalists and people in the civic space get a lot of pressure. For example, when government feels threatened, such as in a time of election contestation, in a time of transition. Those are the moments when the civic space gets challenged the most. And it's important, therefore, to craft our interventions around addressing the challenge. Actually, we need to prepare for those moments of transition, moments of election, when the civic space actually gets challenged. It's also important to also identify, you asked a question on whether or not, it's only governments that actually target people in the civic space. It's not necessarily the case. If you see, for example, some of the latest data relating to physical violence against people in civil society, human rights defenders, you'd find that human rights defenders, particularly in environmental human rights defenders, they have become the major target of physical violence, including killings.
Yes.
More than 50% of people in the civic space who are killed are from this category. So we need to have that disaggregated approach to understanding and therefore calibrate and design interventions in order to have a more effective response and a more effective way of dealing with these issues. As rightly said, women human rights defenders also face enormous pressure and challenge on account of patriarchy, on account of their status in society. And therefore, it's important when we discuss about the shrinking of the civic space to identify which category of the civic space is most affected and why, and design our interventions accordingly.
Thank you very much, Solomon. I will want to come back to all of you with what kind of interventions are effective. If we are capable of formulating them, but before getting to that point, I would ask Martin. You are the director of Luminate Strategic Initiative, an organization that is focused on creating safer and more open and free digital civic spaces. Is the world moving to a better place in this area, or we are seeing a worsening trend when it comes to polarization and misinformation in the digital world? And I'm sure everyone here will appreciate your expert assessment about what is going on Twitter.
Thank you very much. as Hannah, you were saying, protests taking place around the world are increasingly taking place online as well. And when you are subjected to awful physical abuse in different ways, you seek solace online and you try and organize online. Now, this is something where at its best, the online world can contribute to connections, to creativity, and to the activism that you're all working on. And this is something that we've seen in a number of different places during the Arab Spring in the early 2010s, Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement. The problem we have today, I'm afraid, I do think it's getting more constrained. And one specific area I want to talk about is the online sphere is increasingly privatized. We have huge big tech platforms, big tech businesses that are putting company profit at the expense of our democratic online space. And that is something that we all have to be very, very conscious about. I mean, one of my colleagues, mentors, Mariette Schrake, who was an MEP for 10 years, I was just talking to about this yesterday, makes this very valid point. These decisions are made by private companies that should be made by the state, and they should be made by the state by democratically elected officials. And this is an extremely simple point that shouldn't have to be made, but really needs to be made. So why is that a problem? It's a problem because most of the online spaces that activists congregate around are effectively advertising companies, right? They don't care about the activists and giving them the space to be able to fight for gender equality in Iraq or elsewhere. What they want, and their fight, the companies, is for clicks, is to keep us engaged online so they can sell more ads. It's as basic and as depressing as that. And we're seeing it right now, which I can talk about. So it's really, the companies are using mostly illegally acquired data about us to track us, to target us, including the activists that we're talking about, to maximize that online engagement. And what you may say, why is that a problem? I'm fine with that. The problem is that it radically diminishes certain voices online, especially voices of marginalized communities, and it increases the extremes. And so what we see is an online sphere where these algorithms that there's nothing magical about them, they are optimized to drive more engagement and more extreme content. And those algorithms push us towards increasingly more polarized, more hateful, and more divisive content. And it's easy in some ways to talk about this and to step back and to say, well, what can we do about it? We can do a lot about it because the issue is the privatization of that online sphere. The issue is that these are advertising companies who are playing a defining role, in our public space. And we need to separate that. And I think it's incredibly important for us, I think, all to work on, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Ethiopia, whether it's in Argentina, in all different countries. And so I can talk about solutions now, or do you want me to come to it?
You can start.
Sure.
Because I'm going to make a round. I'm going to ask you which type of intervention do you suggest for your specific context. But let's start with George's recommendation.
I'm happy to. I think there are, and we'll talk a little bit about this more later today, I hope so. I think there are four main solutions we need to work on. The first one is in the European Union, where we are today, we have laws in place that can crack down on the business model of big tech. They exist, right? We have, for all their flaws, we have data protection laws, consumer protection laws, competition laws. And we have this disparity in the world between the geography of power over the big tech platforms, where we can do something about it in Europe, and they're mostly either American or Chinese, but there's very little happening in America, and the geography of harm, where most of the most egregious harms take place in Ethiopia, in Iraq, in Sri Lanka, in Colombia. We have a responsibility in Europe to really bridge that gap with enforcement of the laws. That's the first thing. The second one is campaigning. These issues, they touch all of us. It's not the reserve of digital rights activists who've been doing amazing work for the past 15 or 20 years. It's getting together with groups working on gender equality, on racial justice, on climate, on a range of different issues. And we need to have a bigger boat, right, to work on these issues. Third point is, and I'll come back to this at this time, I think we need to reinvent those laws as well for the 21st century. And the fourth point is we need to build these partnerships. I mean, talking to the philanthropic community, the funding community, we work on this. I see in the room colleagues from Open Society Foundations doing fantastic work on this, Ford Foundation Night. Foundations, many of which are in the room, you can count them on the fingers of two hands working on this topic. It's a half dozen. And we need to reach out to groups like the Wellcome Trust working on healthcare, groups working on climate justice, funders throughout the world to really engage in these topics, because it's not the preserve of a few technological geeks or wonks or others. It touches all of us, because the online world is where one of the most important civic space battles is being fought.
Thank you very much, Martin. So I will give you less than a minute to put in the table a main intervention that can stop the threats of civic space in your own context. So what do you have to say, Hannah? Very short, because we want to open the floor to the public.
Thank you. A civil society movement in the country where it means really mobilizing young people, women, and different strata, intellectual, and so on. Now we are really, demanding for, inclusive change and inclusive participation of citizens in the decision making, and for change this system of state failed system. Now we are feeling, or we are calling the system in Iraq is a failed state. And Iraq, if you know, there is nobody, maybe they don't know that it is a rich country of its wealthy, of its, many of the things, but people, they don't receive anything. If you feel that young people, the poverty among young people is so high, more than 30%. We have more than 10 millions of our citizens under poverty line. We have 40% of young people without unemployed. So it is essential for the change. We felt that 2 decades that we have living in a system where they try to speak about democracy, but it was really defame things like that. So that the change it should be that's with the mobilizing people and young people in the dialogue, national dialogue. And this national dialogue, we have to really to make it not only on community, but with the with the government and with the people that they have the dominant the state rule. And so it's not easy, but I feel that with our history of mobilization and the different activities that we have run, especially against sectarianism in the country, because the sectarianism is very thing against the corruptions, against the violations of human rights, and especially the national the rights for peaceful assembly, and the rights for to get there into legislation. Because there are many people, they don't really, as I said, 25% of the people under poverty line.
Thank you, Hannah.
It's increasing.
So mobilization, keeping the momentum for democracy.
For democracy.
Young people.
And also for change, how to change. And this is that people, they should really participate in this change.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Salomon, please.
Obviously, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to interventions as far as addressing the challenge to civic space is concerned. We have to be informed by the kind of challenge that each context presents.
Yes.
In some contexts, it's possible to use litigation as a means for addressing the challenge to civic space. That is particularly the case where you have a relatively more independent judiciary, where the decision of the judiciary is also relatively more enforceable. In other contexts, you have to rely on mobilization, basically, particularly the establishment of coalitions of actors, as he rightly pointed out. Not just people, human rights defenders, and people who are working in civil society, but also people in business, people in academia, people in the trade union, and other sectors of society as well. I think information is extremely important. So the provision of information about the kind of harm, certain trends and developments are, would result in, how they would affect the lives of people, is extremely important. In Africa, we have a supply problem. That is the problem that we have. We don't have a demand problem. We have an enormous demand for more democracy, for more inclusion. You see that in the End SARS movement or protest that happened in Nigeria. You see this, for example, currently in Sudan, where there is an impressive protest movement that is challenging military rule in Sudan and pushing for a democratic dispensation in the country in the face of relentless, violent repression from the authorities. There is a need for solidarity movements around these initiatives by local actors from within the continent, within the region, but also from people across the world. And of
Thank
course,
you so much. We have to
just one last point,
Sí.
the point about the importance of the digital space. Obviously, it cuts both ways, but there are in situations where doing things through organizations, through freedom of assembly is not possible, then indeed the digital space also opens avenues for mobilization and action. I think we have to also protect the digital space, including from the negative forces. Thank you.
I agree completely. No, very short, because I have to go to give the floor to the public for questions. Very, very short, please.
Yes, and there's not much to add because I really agree with both interventions. There's like no magic formula. Unfortunately, we have like country by country to try. And the word I would stress would be like this work has to be done collectively.
Yeah.
Within every country and also with the help of other and, well, Martin, you mentioned donors and other international actors should also, when in countries where democracy levels are very, very low, what sometimes, unfortunately, the in-country organizations are not heard by their own leaders, but maybe others and other international stakeholders are much better heard. Unfortunately, that is the situation. So I would stress that collectively, inside and outside.
Thank you very much. International community is very important. So I'm going to open the floor to the public. If you have any questions, just raise your hand. Please. Do you have a micro? Okay. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Omri Price. I'm the director of Alliance for Europe. We are a non-profit that is dedicated to advancing democracy in Europe, building communities, developing tools for more impact, essentially, for a more robust democracy. When it comes to issues like disinformation and digital rights that we've been talking about, there is so much capacity out there in the field, but it's very fragmented, as you've been saying. How do we build cooperation for more impact? And how do we actually make sure that stakeholders cooperate, not because it's a nice thing to do or because there is some kind of a goodwill there, but when there is an actual interest to do so. So one of the things that we're looking to build is common language and common practices. We've been working with the Disarm framework on disinformation tactics as a way of coordinating action and data sharing. And I would be interested in your view on how we actually build in that given own interest to cooperate, not just as a nicety, but as a necessity. So I'd be keen to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much for doing this.
Do you want to take it, Martin? Thank you.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks for the great question. I think a few things. One of them is we need to work with organizations clearly such as yours and others and meet you and meet those organizations where they are. I think very often there's been a tendency that, and we've been certainly guilty of that in the digital rights community, to sort of explain how technology works. And I think we've done a survey in a number of different European countries looking at hundreds of organizations working on a range of different issues, whether it's migrants' rights, racial justice, as I mentioned. Many of them are working on these topics, but just using different words, talking about it in different ways. So I think meeting those organizations where they are and listening and learning is a first step. The second one is it's an obvious thing to say, but we need a much better evidence base. We need to have really good examples as to why this really matters to people for it to stick and to have much greater public awareness. And so, and the third one is we need that public awareness. All of us. At the end of the day, if we don't get politicians to care because the public cares, we won't get there. So to give an example, you know, data protection, a very geeky topic, the General Data Protection Regulation, we were all very excited about it. I still am, when it was implemented in May 2018. Ultimately, it's not being enforced sufficiently, partly because the public doesn't care. And because the public don't care, the politicians don't care enough. And that's something that all of us, whether it's working on climate, whether it's working on gender equality, whether it's working on youth activism, all of it, have a big responsibility to do and to talk about this issue differently, I think. Happy to talk more.
Do you want to add something? No? Okay. Go ahead, Salomon, please.
I agree with Martin. I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier on is the building of coalitions of actors who work in these areas. With coalitions, I think it would be possible to set priorities, and based on those priorities, to harness the collective influence and the collective wisdom, as well as resources that various organizations have. And I would say that that is really critical.
Thank you. 4 minutes to hear your question and a very rapid response from the panel.
Hello, my name is Anas Dauda Sadoki. I'm the CEO.
We can hear you.
My name is Anas Dauda Sadoki. I'm the CEO founder of Awareness Against Terrorism in Northern Nigeria. So we talk about protests of answers in Nigeria and the protests in Sudan. So what do you say about bandits in Northern Nigeria that are killing innocent people? Especially this train attack in Kaduna, in Kano, Plateau, and any other northern state. What do you say about this one? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think one of the points that is worth highlighting in the African context, in terms of the impact of the shrinking civic space, it has also to do with the increase in the number of conflicts, but also the geographic spread of conflict. I think the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin region that you made reference to has become a territory, particularly for terrorist groups, and it has become actually the epicenter of terrorism in this time and age. And those are the most violent threats affecting civil society and communities, particularly in areas where the effective provision of security by state institutions is lacking. So I think there is a need for the civic community-based organizations like yours to be supported, to be encouraged. There is a need for also addressing the underlying issues affecting, giving rise to that vacuum that is being taken by terrorist groups, such as, for example, socioeconomic marginalization, employment challenge for the youth, education, healthcare, as well as addressing governance deficits that exist in those regions and contexts. Of course, ultimately, it's also important to address the monopoly of violence by the state that needs to be established. Rule of law matters a lot as well. Thank you.
Okay, we have run out of time. We have no opportunity for another question. And I invite you to reach one of the panelists. If you have the question, I just have to close. I have a lot of takeaways. Let me pick 2 or 3, very short. The first one, we have to face the fact and realize that the tailwinds propelling democracy around the world are gone. And now we are facing strong headwinds. So we have to be prepared. Second, civil society organizations need to renew their efforts to communicate with wider audiences. And third, the digital civic space is challenging, but offers a lot of opportunities too. So thank you very much. It has been a pleasure and an honor for me to moderate this panel with all of you. I hope you all the possible success in your own work. Thank you very much.